Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the 6G Symposium. If you've already tuned in on day 1 and or day 2, I hope you're enjoying the session so far. And if it's your first day, well, welcome, and I hope you enjoy today's content. My name is Matti Bloxham. I head up the research group looking at the telecom, media and technology industries at Bloomberg Intelligence. We're essentially the investment research arm of Bloomberg with about 350 people worldwide, looking at markets and helping our clients navigate the world of investments. Now, today's opening keynote session is looking at research, design and innovation for a 6G world. Specifically, I think we're going to touch on or explore how the R&D community should address the development of 6G, whether we should be looking to do things differently from how previous technologies, 4G, 5G, have been developed, if there are lessons that can be learnt from those development pathways, and how we can start to make use of new techniques and approaches, looking at a kind of more holistic system view to kind of help deliver a beyond 5G communication system that 6G is aiming to be. And I'm delighted to welcome 3 experts in the field of communication to share their views with us on this important topic. I'm joined by Matti, Latva-aho, who is director of the 6G Flagship program at the University of Oulu. Catherine van Holder, who is a futurist, recently working with Pantopicon, and Derek O'Halloran, who is a member of the executive committee at the World Economic Forum. And just to give you a quick sense of how we'll run this session today, each of our panelists is going to give you some prepared remarks, sharing their thoughts on the topic. And then once we've got to the end of those shared remarks, we will open the floor to Q&A. So if you do have a question, don't hold back. Feel free to kind of put it into the Q&A field already. And as we get to the, I guess, the middle of the session, we'll start to take on those questions and hopefully we'll be able to kind of answer them all. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Matti, who is going to kick off the prepared remarks. Matti Latva-aho, as I mentioned, is a director of the 6G Flagship program at the University of Oulu. He is worked in communications all his life and is also the Academy Professor at the University Department for Communications Engineering. So Matti, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and good morning, everybody. Can I have the second slide, please? So what we are witnessing right now is probably the biggest digital transformation we have seen so far, and which mobile communications and mobile connectivity has played a major role already since establishing the first analog cellular systems 4 years ago, and continued with the mobile broadband made possible via 3G and 4G technologies. Human behavior, the way we are doing our daily business things, be connected to our loved ones, our colleagues, has dramatically changed. And now we are at the edge of the next transformation. We probably don't know exactly how the society is going to be changed, but it's really, really clear that the change is going to be massive. When we are connecting a huge number of things, processes, machines, to be part of this mastermind of future digital society. This transformation is not going to happen by itself. Lots of efforts are going on, and more is needed. Better understanding is needed. What, how, why, and when we look at, for example, the business perspectives and value chains coming from different critical vertical areas, I dare to claim that we do not understand well enough thoroughly how these different verticals function really, who are the key players, what are the incentives and value creation mechanisms relate to each and every one of these in order to become really holistic part of the future. Next one, please. We have started our 6G flagship program already 3 years ago, and have done quite a bit of thinking about what are the key drivers, what are the things necessitating 6G, and of course, since we are a wireless research institution, our main focus is in those technological matters, but that's not the main scope of this session today. There are several aspects related to necessitating 6G: societal, business, standards, and technology, if I categorize them to these four major areas. Digitalization of society and massive efforts to try to achieve UN Sustainability Development Goals are really the societal needs to necessitate whatever we are doing and developing for the future. And wireless communications will be one of the critical parts of the future, making and enabling completely new things that no one ever could imagine beforehand. And this is going to really seriously disrupt the business models. Now we are living in a world where mobile network operators are in the center of everything. Maybe in the future that's not the only case or the only business model that we have to consider. We have to look at how these different vertical areas will be satisfied, and how, for example, the roles of societies are taken into better consideration in the future. There's every 10 years, in past at least, a new mobile communication standard, and there's no reason to believe that that would not happen also in the future. There are many reasons for that. Development of technologies and the World Radio Conference allocating always new frequency bands, really launching the huge technology development processes in industry. But although there's every 10 years a new technology, only every 20 years the major changes in the businesses is taking place and happening, as we have seen in the past. And that's probably the case also in the future. And that's why we have to see 5G and 6G as a one entity, which 5G is starting, and then maybe there are issues that 5G cannot deliver, or we invent some new ones, new needs which 6G need to deliver. From technology perspectives, there are many different aspects and really exciting possibilities to explore in depth what the possibilities will be in the end of the day. Probably the topmost priority is to make sure that the future solution is secure and we are maintaining privacy. That's really the key. If the business landscape is really going to new venues, there are new players, new private networks here and there, we consumers, we really have to trust that our personal information is kept in a secure manner. Of course, for the future, that which keeps us wireless engineers extremely busy is to look at how to make the next generation technology more efficient than the solutions so far. Efficiency can be measured in terms of bandwidth or data rate, latency of transmission or delivering services, and for example, localization accuracy in the future. And that kind of these requirements are suggesting that we are going to higher and higher frequency bands of spectrum. There's been a lot of discussion on possibilities and capabilities of artificial intelligence and enabling network automation, delivering new types of services, etc., etc. But maybe another challenge to be added to that is to maybe to look at also energy efficiency related matters to AI. Next one, please. Now, if you look at these four major key drivers to 6G, I'm asking some questions for this discussion this morning, that when we look at these societal challenges and really the great potential that this transformation is going to offer us, who do we trust in the future in general to really trust building this smart society, delivering really trustworthy, secure services to us consumers? We already saw that in 5G there was a huge resistance against 5G technology mainly because of these millimeter wave frequency bands that were introduced first time, and many people got afraid that it's a health issues there. And now with 6G we are talking about even terahertz frequency bands, so we can really expect this resistance to be more furious compared to 5G, and that's something that we should probably work on and try to avoid beforehand. In business landscape, everything is currently mobile network operator centric. There are now lots of signs of change. For example, in Japan, they have a concept called local 5G access or local 5G network. So there are several countries where already these lower frequency bands have been assigned for local usage, allowing new types of operational models, new types of private networks or open networks for local service delivery. So the question is that how do we move faster away from these mobile network operators' protectionism that they are practicing, especially in Europe, which is very, very obvious and strong. How do we move forward to make this digitalization of societies faster? Standardization is, of course, the key for everything, and global standard is probably the goal still also for 6G, despite of this geopolitical debate that has been going on for a few years in 5G. I'm not personally participating in standards meetings, but what I keep hearing from everywhere that the meetings are really massive, and the amount of documents is so huge that no one can handle it. So is that type of working still practical in the future? Are there things that should be automated? Are there let's say leaner ways of handling everything? And then the last thing, which is by no means least, is that when we look at the big promise that 5G has been introducing, 6G is accelerating. We are going to completely new frequency bands of operation, necessitating completely new types of RF implementations, new materials for making these circuits and antennas available. We are looking at totally new and multiple different ways of delivering communications over wireless networks. And networking is really going through big changes already in 5G and more so in 6G. Artificial intelligence is going to be, let's say, a clue tying together many really complex matters in future systems. The students of today, they have to really master this really complicated field, and they have to be really multi-talents, mastering different disciplines. And how do we do that? How do we attract young people to really choose this field? Because we need also future engineers, and for obvious reasons. So these are my thoughts for this morning, and I'm handing it back to Matti.
Great, thank you very much, Matti. I think that's an excellent framing of the topic we're looking at today, and you raised some very interesting questions that hopefully we can explore later in the session. So next we're going to turn to Derek O'Halloran. As I mentioned before, Derek is a member of the Executive Committee at the World Economic Forum and is currently leading the system initiative on the future of the digital economy. So Derek, if I can hand over you to kind of give us your thoughts and perspectives on this topic. Thank you.
Great, thanks Matthew, and thanks Matti for those great inputs as well. Very useful. Thanks to everybody for having me here today. It's a great pleasure. I was really excited when I saw the fact that we were having this symposium and we're having these discussions, because I think it's really important that we think about where, Matti raised some really important questions about, how do we imagine society to be, and can we be conscious in developing our pathway towards that? At the same time, of course, we probably need to be a little bit, cognizant of the fact that we're talking about a set of technologies that for the large part don't really exist yet today. So we probably want to take some of our assertions with a pinch of salt. But I do think that if we take a step back and take a little bit of a broader perspective, we can see some macro trends that probably give us some clues about, where all of this is likely to land, where it's taking us directionally, and what that means for development and research and indeed collaboration over the next, let's say, decade. So what I'd like to do is maybe just share some hypotheses from my side around what that looks like. They are just hypotheses, so as I say, we take with a degree of with a pinch of salt, as our friends in the Dogecoin community like to say, not financial advice, but nevertheless like to share kind of my perspectives on that. I'll build actually on Matti's framing there. If we think about the generations and what we've seen through the different generations, and maybe go a little bit deeper on some of the industry, some of the application domains and the industry dynamics, and what the implications are there from a research point of view and a societal point of view. So, within the 4G, 3G, 4G sort of era, what we saw was that unlocked a huge amount of innovation, and innovation that we couldn't have predicted in advance. And it also was really reliant on the fact that there was a number of other technologies coming on board at the same time, whether that was geopositioning data, whether it was motion sensor, whether it was around for smaller and faster compute capabilities that could get things into a phone. It gave birth to the app kind of economy, and the application domain was primarily consumer. And from an industry dynamic point of view, we saw a real tension emerge between the operators and the over-the-top players, right? And I think that continues today, Matti, and some of the perspectives you were sharing, like that dynamic still felt by many. And what we started to see was a couple of industries started to really blur, telecom and media, for a while we thought maybe they're the same industry now. And you started to see new types of value pools emerging. So social media, new media, there were markets effectively that didn't exist before, and they were created by the technology. 5G, you see sort of against each of those different parameters, you see a slightly different set of things emerging. So you think about, well, what are some of the adjacent technologies? You're thinking about cloud, you're thinking about edge computing, you're thinking about AI. The capabilities of low latency, really kind of drive a different set of applications, primarily around connected things, and therefore the application domain is much more around industrial. So we know that in excess of 60% of use cases around 5G are in manufacturing, a good chunk of the rest ones around automotive and healthcare, and so it transforms people's lives indirectly through industries. But from an economic and industry point of view, this is driving further blurring of boundaries between industries across all sectors. And I wasn't going to share slides, but just on the basis of Matti's comments, I'm just going to share this one slide to maybe illustrate what this looks like from a point of view. Is, if we think about traditional industries, they were largely vertically integrated along fairly consistent supply chains. I don't know if you can see my screen there. Apologies if you can't. They were largely vertically integrated. If you think of the automotive industry, people made steel, ball bearing, wheels, put it together into a car, and then you sell it in the market. What's emerging now is a mobility ecosystem, which is probably going to generate around about $130 billion annually in market revenues in about 10 years. But it involves creating ecosystems across all of these different industries, right? So it's not even that it just changed auto, it completely rewrites the boundaries of where industries, like what industries are. And I think earlier in the week, we heard 5G ACI talk about the need to integrate more industry perspectives into the development of standards. We then play that forward to say, well, what does 6G look like? And what are some of the things that we might expect there? Well, if you're thinking about the ubiquitous and instant kind of connectivity that's around, and what are some of the the likely adjacent technologies, I think we're going to see over the same period a real emergence of crypto-based systems for both enterprises or businesses, let's say, as well as governance. And the massive decentralization that will be enabled by 6G, in my mind, will be intimately tied up with the shift towards crypto-based models for value creation across different sectors, and Web3. And the other probably major adjacent technology space will be space and the proliferation of low Earth orbit, cheap, accessible low Earth orbit deployment of technologies for entrepreneurs. What that will mean is, when you think about what's the impact of further decentralizing, if 4G collapsed a couple of industries, tech and media, 5G is starting to collapse multiple industries in these complex ecosystems around new value pools. Around 6G and crypto, we're going to completely rewrite the fundamentals of how we do business, how we organize ourselves, and how we create value, how we exchange value, and how we consume value in society. So if we think about, well, what does that mean for today? Matti, you talk about how do we get the folk and the multi-talents. One way you do that is collaboration. So probably the big lesson on 5G from 4G is, can we, from a commercial point of view, partner with other industries rather than getting into an adversarial position? But we probably learned a little late that actually we could have sowed the seeds there if we had collaborated on a technical basis earlier. So if we think about then in the 6G space, I think my sort of key sort of thought there would be, I would recommend that we very actively don't try and solve all of the problems ourselves. There's a multi-talent aspect that's important, but we build those collaborative ecosystems around not just the industries as they exist today, but around maybe what we might think is strange bedfellows. So reaching out to the crypto community, reaching out, by the way, critically to governments, right, and helping them to think through what the future looks like, so that we don't end up trying to solve 6G's problems through a 5G lens, and that we're solving for where the puck will be rather than where it is today. So I'll wrap it up there. Maybe the only final comment, I'll just again sort of do a +1 on what Matti was talking about, was the importance of tackling SDGs. And I think the other macro trend that we'll see over the next year is the embedding of purpose into every business model, and the higher expectations from individuals that businesses do that. And so the more we're thinking in that broader context, then the better.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Derek. Some fascinating insights there. A very interesting viewpoint on crypto, I think, which seems to be touching everything at the moment. Now, before we move on to Catherine, I just wanted to remind everybody that you can ask questions. In fact, I think we'd love for you to ask questions so that we can kind of really explore the topic in some more detail. So please do go in and write a question, and we'll definitely do our best to answer it when we get to that part of the session. So I'm going to invite Catherine Van Holder to share her thoughts with us. Catherine is a futurist, a freelance futurist now, who until recently worked at a company called Pantopicon, which is an Antwerp-based studio for design and foresight. She's now, as well as being a freelance futurist, working on a PhD. So she's keeping herself very busy, and the PhD, I believe, is the application of complex systems worldview within future studies, which I think is incredibly relevant, because I think it's clear from what we've heard already today that the world is already incredibly complex, and 6G is just adding to that complexity, and trying to kind of unpick it and make sense of it all is going to be, I think, incredibly important to make sure that we deliver a 6G system that's fit for purpose. So, Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm really happy to be here, to be able to share some more generalist perspectives next to the very expertise perspectives. So next slide, please, Alex. So I was approached with a fairly straightforward question. The question was, okay, so if we are looking further in the future, so we would like to know how this evolution of communications might evolve, but it might also be interesting to get a firm grasp on how the world might look like 20, 30 years from now. And because that might somehow inspire us to make some roadmap from today till 20, 30 years from now. And of course, we have to keep all those aspirations, sustainable development goals, and all of those. We have to keep them in the back of our head because they are also very important in terms of trying to make a smarter Europe. Today, my presentation is actually going to highlight why such an approach is a little bit difficult from a futurist perspective, why it's actually not really feasible, and what kind of methods we might use, or what kind of approaches and mindsets we might use to tackle it. Next slide, please. So let me first get into the why of making this straightforward roadmap and having a clear picture of how the world might look like 20, 30 years from now. It's a bit difficult. So the first thing is that when we're talking about society and its subsystems, those are actually complex systems. That means they're highly independent, interdependent. So you have one change in one of those systems. Let's say you have a COVID all of a sudden, it might ignite changes in all those others. That means that actually it's impossible to predict the future. It's impossible to know in what kind of world we'll live 20, 30 years from now, because you might have some discontinuous. So what do we do as futurists? When we talk about futures, in general, we use scenarios. We use a multitude of possible futures, and we try to explore those possible futures and hence try and get a firm grasp on the challenges or of the opportunities and so on and so on. A second thing, which is a bit difficult, is if we were to try and construct a roadmap linking today with tomorrow, and we keep those SDGs, those sustainable development goals, in the back of our minds, most of those are actually wicked problems, which means those are problems that we do not straightforwardly know how to solve. We don't really know how we should tackle those. So this makes it quite difficult to work in terms of roadmaps. Next slide, Alex. So as a futurist, we're actually experts in trying to embrace complexity and to somehow work with uncertainty. So we have a very different approach. It's not a very linear one, but that doesn't mean we have to just move ahead in the dark. So let me quickly touch upon some of the methodologies we use for exploring futures and for them to guide us in our pathway to tomorrow. Next slide. So as I said, we have it's very difficult to somehow predict how the future might look like. So what we do in general is we work with future scenarios. So a diversity of a set of narratives, how this tomorrow might look like. There are many ways in which we can construct scenarios. I don't have the time to cover it all, but let me make it a little bit more tangible by quickly illustrating it through means of an example of the city of Ghent. So they wanted to somehow explore how they could use technology and to become a smart city, which they call city of people. So they have a slightly specific perspective on how a smart city might look like. And the process was kicked off by first constructing 4 different narratives of how the world might look like in 20, 30 years from now. So for example, in corporate lift, you had a very corporate, there was a lot of power in the hands of a few corporations. Those were the ones who were really in control of most of the things. Most people were leading a prosperous life. You have a very light government who somehow interfere a little bit, but not that much. And then you had another one, it was climate cascade, in which actually the effects of climate change were disruptive to such an effect that you had a very difficult economy. You had a depression, actually. Many people were unemployed. So there was a lot of difficulties in this world. The third world was actually taking into account a move beyond the GDP. So value creation was no longer measured in terms of economic value, but businesses were also tackling ecological problems. We're also tackling socio-cultural problems, but this is how value creation was measured. And then you had a fourth one, which you had a very state-controlled approach, etc., etc. So you have 4 images of futures, and depending on those futures, next slide, please. Of course, you have a variety of actors, which are more important or less important. In one of those scenarios, you have cities who are pretty strong. In another one, you have companies who are more main actors. You have different challenges and opportunities, different leverage points. Imagine if ecology is really a big problem, probably you will have different leverage points towards a better future than if everything is going quite smooth. So this is one of the ways in which you can somehow deal with uncertainty in those futures. So this is a way in which we can tackle the bigger picture, like societal picture. Yeah, you can take the next one. If we were to look at a certain element, so if we were to look at a certain technology, if we were to look at how might a circular city look like, another methodology we tend to use is speculative design or design fiction. I think most of you might know Black Mirror, in which they look at first, but also second and third order effects of integration of certain technologies in society. And this is not only something which is done in leisure context. MIT Media Lab, for a number of years, they had a department that was really looking in how can we use those kind of tools in terms of advancing towards the future. We also use it to explore some elements of digital twinning and the effect on governance. We use it to somehow envision how might a circular city look like, and so on. Next slide. So while the first 2 approaches, it's actually, you're not really in the driver's seat. You're just exploring how those worlds might look like, and you're trying to grasp the complexity and trying to grasp the implications of it. Sometimes you also want to move towards a desired future. You have this idea of how a better future might look like. So then you start envisioning. One of the most interesting things about envisioning is that you will have a number of visions on how a better world in the future might look like. So you might have a clash of perspectives, depending on the kind of personality you are, the kind of business you work in, and so on and so on. Sometimes it's really interesting to use scenarios to start from before you start creating a vision. For example, we were working for the Flemish governmental department who's in control of waste management. Most of those people, when they were thinking about circular economy, they were thinking about the low-tech economy. So what did we do? We used 2 scenarios, a high-tech one and a low-tech one, a more communal one. And we asked them to start from those 2 different scenarios. Because at that moment in time, they were forced to think out of their mindset, to think out of their idea of desired future. So you can combine those. Next slide. The thing with visions and envisioning, which is quite important to keep in mind, that it's a value approach. So while engineering and technology might seem sometimes value-free, it actually isn't. It will always have a certain perspective on how a future world will look like, on how a desired world will look like, which somehow, to a certain extent, not completely, but to a certain extent, might also be a reason why there is a backlash sometimes to the adoption of certain technologies. Next slide. So let me use a simple vision of the future. So let's take the Sustainable Development Goals as a future compass. We want to reach those. So if we want to connect today with that future, that fourth future, you'll have actually 3 horizons. So the first horizon is today. The third horizon is the future, like the further away future. And then the second horizon is actually the horizon we are looking at. So how can we move from today to tomorrow? Next slide. I already stated those are wicked problems. I mean, if we look at the SDGs, most of those are wicked problems. So we will not be able to do a roadmap. So how should we approach it? Next slide. most of it's not because it's fuzzy, it's not because it's wicked that you're just driving in the dark. It's just you don't have a straightforward roadmap. So what you'll do, and don't get into all the details don't try to decipher all the details on the notes here. It's just trying to explain how you can, on the one hand, have concerns in the present, some aspirations, and then you take innovations and inspirational practices to somehow ignite R&D. For example, we use it in an urban city lab in Antwerp, who was geared towards sustainability. Sustainability, quite a wicked problem. How can we become a sustainable city? And we decided upon certain tracks, certain subjects. Like, for example, we looked into how can peer-to-peer and sharing city, how might it help us move toward a more sustainable city? And then you bring a number of stakeholders, you have a number of steps you take, and you start exploring those questions. Not to find answers, not to know or to completely tackle this sustainability issue, but to learn things from. To learn what are the pitfalls, to learn what works, what does not work, and so on and so on. Next slide. Another example out of, most people won't be able to read those because it's in Dutch, but it's a really interesting example of our work with the governmental organization in charge of waste management. So we, after envisioning how circular economy might look like, to close the loops, to use the outputs as inputs, they asked us, like, if we wanted to couple smart tech with circular, how could we do it? So you start checking some leverage points, some elements in which you could create a more circular economy, a circular city. And then you start to see what kind of opportunities does technology might give us. We looked at the number of streams, for example, food is an interesting one. And then you go and see, like, if, for example, you have a company and they have some residual flows, which they don't use. That waste might actually be an input for another company. And how could you use IoT, for example, to make that connection? So you start working with multiple actors, so across industries, in which you bring those expertise together. Next slide. And maybe to finalize, to wrap up my story, is like, it's not only a matter of multiple actors. And I think if there's anything that I've been trying to convey through my presentation is you have a diversity of mindsets who all have their value and all have a very different function. So if you're exploring futures, you go and look and deal with uncertainty. You have design to make certain things tangible, engineering, how to make things work. You have humanities on things, how to create a valuable society. So it's actually not only a matter of having multiple actors, but also a way or a matter of trying to bring all those different mindsets together. I'll wrap it up here, but I'm already really curious about questions.
Great, thank you very much for that, Catherine. Fascinating insights, and there's quite a few slides there that I'm going to be looking at more closely after the session. So yeah, we've got about 15 minutes or so for Q&A now. We've had a few come in. Don't be shy, if you do have a question, feel free to post it, and we will answer it. I think I'm going to I guess as a starting point, one of the questions that came in, Matti, was something that you mentioned, questioning, I guess, the role of a standards organization like 3GPP in the development of 6G, and whether we need to be more radical about how we develop 6G. So, I mean, maybe I'll start with you, Matti, but, obviously everybody else, I'm sure, has got a view on that too. And I guess it may be beyond just the specifics about 3GPP, but, whether there's anything, I guess, specific that you see in how 4G or 5G is being developed that, would be an obvious thing to change in the development of 6G. So, Matti, maybe if I start with you.
The system is going to be far more complex. And our current thinking is that some of the critical vertical application areas for example, automotive versus healthcare systems. They would deserve to have really unique, customized wireless connectivity solutions for it. So it might be that we need a set of different alternative solutions optimally serving different verticals. That's one potential way that we might see, who knows. But another one, which is far more clear and happening now, which I already touched a little bit, is the spectrum regulation related matter on local spectrum licenses. The role of that is going to greatly increase. The physics of higher frequency band usage is speaking for it. That's the only way to see it when we go to 100 gigahertz and above frequency bands. There's absolutely no way we should practice countrywide spectrum licenses for that high frequency band. So that's happening. That's very clearly happening. And that's a big change. There are lots of legislation-related matters that should be resolved and changed in European telecom laws, making all these necessary changes possible, which now the laws have been set for countrywide operation of networks, more or less so. So there are lots of changes needed. But the standards process itself, I think I'm the wrong person to answer to that.
Derek, Catherine, any perspectives from you on this topic?
Yeah, I think, regardless of whether it's organization A or B, I do think that creating mechanisms where one can have ongoing and sustained input from different types of stakeholders that are, let's say, creatively imagined in the first instance, will be really important. And I would see that as, obviously around the communication protocols, there's going to be a core community that are driving that, but having that informed both by not just needs, but developments in other areas, I think would be really beneficial. I mentioned crypto, but let me give another example. If I think, I mentioned briefly space. There's a company, Astra, which is developing. They're the third U.S. private company to put things into orbit, and they have developed the low-cost technology using regular materials like aluminium and so on, to develop an entire rocket delivery system, which they can ship to anyone in 5 shipping containers. And you can install this anywhere where you've got a patch of concrete in 5 days with 5 people, and launch a rocket with payloads into space to enable the an entire kind of network of connectivity. And by the way, the spectrum issue will only get more complex through there. But really consciously architecting those relationships with the different communities that are developing different technologies, I think would be highly beneficial, and will avoid us kind of stumbling over some of the knock-on consequences 7-8 years down the road, which is essentially what's happened with 4G and 5G.
Great, thank you. Catherine, is there anything you'd like to add before we move on to some of the other questions?
Not really.
Okay.
I'll comment quickly to Derek on this satellite connectivity component, which is definitely a hypey topic right now. The promises that satellite community is making are not realistic, really. There are reasons why we have millions and millions of LTE base stations covering Earth right now instead of satellites. So looking at the physics and distances and the locations where we are trying to make connectivity to the network are rather difficult for global ubiquitous satellite connectivity. Satellite will have a role, but it will be anyways also niche in the future. It's not the mainstream in our opinion, and terrestrial mobile connectivity is the key also in the future, which will be augmented by satellite in some specific scenarios if the paying customers are there.
Yeah, so just to respond quickly, so I fully agree with that, Matti, and my comments are not around kind of current commercial offerings, but I think in some of the innovations that are developing, and not all of those will necessarily be assuming that you need a kind of a full-blown communications channel. They may pick up lighter or more edge sort of use cases, particularly around machines. And so again, it's kind of from some of the more innovative folk there are, again, thinking from a different paradigm, right? They're not thinking from a 3G, 4G, where you're starting with a communication and then you're putting something on top. But actually, you know, well, i.e. interpersonal communication. But they're looking at that piece of there, and then actually you've got much lighter needs, but potentially exponentially growing set of use cases. But it will always be complementary, clearly from a human connectivity to the on-Earth infrastructure.
Great. So I'm going to try to kind of wrap a few different questions we've had into kind of one broader theme. And maybe I'll invite Catherine to start first with this one, if she wants to. I guess my question is, does 6G need like a single problem that it's trying to solve for it to be a success? I guess if you look at kind of historic mobile technologies, you know, I guess 2G was pretty successful because it was, you know, taking an initial mobility solution and improving on it by making it digital. 3G, I think, tried to do too many things, and 4G was, I think, very clearly about, you know, making fast data connectivity over mobile possible. And I just kind of wonder whether 6G needs that clarity, and maybe there are lots of different problems that it could try to solve, and perhaps that's where some of the kind of futurist scenarios can kind of help to identify what those problems are, to narrow down on what it should be trying to solve to be a success.
Yeah, I think it somehow boils down to the idea of the uncertainty in terms of futures. I truly believe that after a certain way, of course, there might be one or more directions that become clearer. But I think where we are today, it's a matter of exploring different possibilities. It's I saw an interesting question on the Q&A as well, talking about, should technology be an enabler, or should we like take into account how that society might look like and then try to solve those problems? I think it's both. I think it's a combination of mindsets that you use, and you somehow try to bring that complexity together. And technology has always, this is one of the things I really find interesting about the panel today, is like when I look at the input of all three panelists, it's very complementary. Of course, you are in the driver's seat, and of course, technology is very enabling, and technology, at a certain point, the success will depend on it will become clear which one, but this moment in time, it's not. And it's a matter of trying to embrace that complexity, to work with it, to move forward.
Great, thank you. Matti, any perspectives on this? Whether there is a clear problem or if it needs one to solve?
Yeah, first of all, we need to wait and see how successful 5G will be and in what exact areas and what do we need to improve. That's very clear. So far, it looks like it's continuing mainly the mobile broadband track where the biggest revenues are for operators. But we can also start to look at, since we are now in research phase, and we can start to look at what is missing from 5G that is desperately needed for the future. Doesn't matter is it whatever G it's making, but what is desperately needed. And there are a couple of things. First of all, connecting the last billions of humans who are not part of any network. There are a lot of challenges related to that. Most of them completely non-technical. It's cost issue, accessibility issue, backhauling issue, financial issues, basically. But those are easy to solve, so to say. If money can solve, it's easy to solve. It's easy for me, at least, to say and claim. And another technical thing which is missing from 5G largely is accurate positioning or accurate sensing, 3D sensing of your environment by using radio communication signals. That is missing. It's going to be possible because of the really high frequency bands we are going to utilize. Then third one I would like to raise here is which is still a little bit undergoing with 5G, is the new feature with it is machine type communications. Really optimized communication protocols and schemes for connecting machines, automated things in, for example, in factory environments. We researchers are very well aware of the really, let's say, controversial requirements for different use cases related to machine type communications. And there is not a unique solution yet. There is not a unique solution really which would be superior coming from 5G standards process yet. Maybe it's coming out there, but that's an area where we are, for example, putting a lot of research efforts. So there are these things and which are foreseen from technology perspective. And then maybe futurists or application designers can take it from there and say, okay, what would be the fantastic, sensational new applications that you might start to craft utilizing these technical capabilities and building blocks.
Thanks. Derek, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think do we need to be, which way do we need to be driven? I think it's both at the same time. That's the story of our times. Technology is both, something we can shape and it shapes us, and we just have to kind of get used to that. I think looking for the killer app in advance is really, really tough. We've never managed to do that anytime before, so I wouldn't expect that we'd be able to do it. The communication protocols are essentially a platform for innovation, and so you never know what's going to come out there. I do think thinking about what's missing, and one of the things that I think about, I can't really get my head around, to be honest, is what are the cost dynamics going to look like around this? Because it's very clearly it's going to push towards decentralization, but to what extent will there be large capital infrastructure required, and how does that balance with some of the decentralized models that it's pushing towards? It's not completely unanswerable, but I think it's an interesting question to think about as we're developing the technology. Can we think about low unit cost and whatever we define that to mean, but how can that help tackle some of the challenges with connecting the rest of the world's population, which is not all just infrastructure access, but it's certainly an important piece of it. So yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we've got just a few minutes left, and actually I think that's a great segue into what I was thinking my next question would be, which is, brings together a few things. Matti, one of the questions Matti asked was whether, how much of the challenge is going to be to kind of current operator-led business models. It's a very, very kind of centralized system. Derek, you just mentioned this decentralization. One of the questions we had was about the role of open RANs. I guess the question would be, how do we bring this together? Are the operators, is the kind of current communications industry going to be able to hold on to control, or is 6G going to be, along with things like Open RAN, a way to decentralize communications networks, almost in the way that the internet's kind of evolved on a standard technology, but kind of very much as kind of lots of things coming together. So maybe Derek, you were talking there already. I mean, do you think Open RAN has a strong role to play? Do you really think we're going to see a fundamental change in the way the industry operates and no more big carriers in the future?
Yeah, sorry, Matti, did you want to jump in? Well, look, many of my partners and friends are big carriers, so but let me say that I do think that already today, I mean, already with 4G, we've challenged the business model. With 5G, people are trying to figure out how do you make these collaborative ecosystems work across different sectors. And it's tough, but I think we'll get there. And I think Open RAN will have a really important role to play in that. I think by the time we get to 6G or beyond 5G, whatever, the further you keep pushing into decentralization and small cell, you need to have decentralized business, much more kind of like it's the equivalent, it's the same concept of small cell from a technology point of view to a business model point of view. And what does that look like? Well, control in a decentralized thing is a funny word, and it's a different concept. So if we're thinking in platform terms, how could an operator really transform into being a platform? What does that really mean? And what does that look like? I think is the challenge that, you know, the kind of 5-10 year challenge that operators have to face from an economic model point of view.
Matti.
Okay, so this Open RAN is a beautiful, nice idea, but unfortunately we are technically quite far away from realizing it. There are lots of issues and challenges. There are also issues and challenges related to security. There are issues and challenges related to energy efficiency and then compatibility. But what is the best part of it, in my opinion? It might be really the necessary thing to speed up customization of products, customization of access technologies to different critical verticals. And that's really something that we should openly look at right now when we are still in early phase of research towards 6G.
Great. Thanks for that, Matti. And Catherine, I'm just going to offer you the chance to wrap up the session with some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I find it an interesting question when you ask a question about centralized versus decentralized. I would dare to ask a question, could they work together? Would it be possible? I noticed Derek talking about platforms. A platform is, of course, making use of that decentralized is a decentralized way, but at the same time, it's very centralized. So I think sometimes it's a matter of looking at it from a different perspective, and then trying to see if you have different combinations or how it might look like. So it's actually a bit stepping out of the box, because it's true, we have to still look at some of the issues that Matti was talking about, but you can also try and look at it from a different perspective.
That's right. I think that's a great way to wrap up the session. So Catherine, Derek and Matti, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and expertise in the session today. Thank you to everybody for joining the session and asking your questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium today. So thank you very much.